Dividing the discussion into two parts. One, I'll talk a little bit about Heidegger and his background, a little bit about his thinking, and then I'm going to talk about the exciting part about how I got interested in philosophy and how I got interested in Heidegger and the way things were a long time ago when I was an undergraduate. Well, who was Martin Heidegger? Today, he's known as a great thinker. He's also known as a very controversial thinker. So I'm going to try to give you some background into his thought. And there's a picture of Heidegger. That's a pretty standard picture in his later years. Okay. Now, as we see here, Heidegger was born in 1889. And he started out, he wanted to become a priest. He wanted to become, actually, to study with the Jesuits. And I always ask my intro students about, everyone knows what a Jesuit is, don't they? Well, Heidegger wanted to become a priest, and his mother wanted him to become a priest. But he became ill very early on in the seminary. And he had to abandon that and began studying philosophy and theology. He earned his doctorate in 1913 and began his teaching career in 1914 through 16. After World War I, he began studying with the eminent philosopher and was the teaching assistant of Edmund Husserl for several years. Now, before I get to the next point, Heidegger was a very brilliant lecturer. At that time, he wasn't even paid. He was an unsalaried lecturer. He would receive food and basic sustenance, but he didn't actually get a paycheck. Well, things were much easier in those days. You didn't have to pay car insurance and what have you. Well, he began lecturing and began developing a very stellar reputation as a teacher. And the story goes is that his lectures were so great that his reputation spread like the rumor of a hidden king. He was sort of the new leader, the new upcoming star in philosophy. I heard a story one time that was told to me by a friend who came over from Italy to UNO, who gave a talk on Heidegger after Katrina. And he told me that when Heidegger gave lectures, the students would get so excited they would stomp their feet in approval, like you would do at like a rock concert or something like that. So as Heidegger continued on into the mid-1920s, he was trying to gain a position as a professor, but he hadn't published much. And one day, as the story goes, the dean came into his office and said, "Professor Heidegger, what have you published?" And Heidegger looked down and he was a little embarrassed. And he says, "Not much, but I have this new manuscript I'm working on." And he reached into his drawer and pulled out a manuscript over 1,000 pages like this. And he said to the dean, "I'm sorry, this is all I got." And the dean says, "Okay, we're going to have to go ahead and publish it." So Heidegger submitted it for publication, and about a month later he got a letter back with a rejection slip. And it said insufficient. Of course, it wasn't ultimately going to be rejected, but that's one of the funniest ironies, that perhaps the greatest philosophical work of the 20th century was initially rejected for publication.
It's insufficient.
Right, insufficient. And this, as Connor knows from studying, this was the book that ultimately was published as Being in Time. Now, to go back, around 1926, before Being in Time came out and when it was in the page proofs, or maybe early 27, Heidegger's mother became very ill. And the book finally came out and he visited her literally on her deathbed and brought her a copy fresh off the press of his book. And he was sort of trying to make peace with his mother because his mother, as I mentioned, had been so disappointed that he didn't become a priest. But at least he'd become a successful philosopher. So that's one of the interesting aspects. Well, maybe we can revisit a little bit. As we know, and this is one of the parts about Heidegger, and it's become more transparent and problematic recently, was his brief connection throughout the 1930s with the National Socialist Party. And after World War II, Heidegger was prohibited from teaching. And he returned under this umbrella of what was called the Club in Bremen, which was sort of like an intellectual club, informal. And that's when he gave his first lectures that came to be called The Question Concerning Technology, that are among his most influential. And then in 1975, Heidegger started the publication of his complete edition, or Gesamtausgabe, of his writings. And as it says here, he dies in 1976. And the complete edition of his writings are still under publication in German. There are projected 102 volumes. And that shows you how much, in terms of lectures and books and essays, that he wrote. If you go over to Tulane, or Loyola for that matter, they have in their library the complete works of Heidegger, though there are still volumes to be published, and they just take up big parts of shelf after shelf, because that's a lot of writings that he had. Now, in his complete edition, he has this little motif, and it says, "Ways, not works." So in other words, he did not subscribe to a philosophical system, but he always developed different pathways of thinking. Now, along with the publication of this complete edition, there's an ongoing effort to translate all of these writings into English. And by the way, there are also translations in French, in Italian, in Spanish, and even in Japanese. So you can see the interest that there is in Heidegger's works. I have here a copy of a letter that was sent to me by Heidegger's son, Hermann Heidegger, in 2008. Hermann Heidegger's still alive. He's about 90 years old. And he gave me permission to do a translation of one of Heidegger's essays from 1945, right after the end of World War II. And the little essay is published in this book. It's only about 5 pages. It's called Poverty. In German, it's called Die Armut. So Hermann Heidegger, Heidegger's son, gave me permission to translate and to publish this little essay. I kid Dr. Phillips, my esteemed colleague, about poverty. I won't go into the specifics. But it starts out with this quote from the famous German poet. And it says, "Everything is concentrated on the spiritual. We became poor in order to become rich." So that's what I tell Dr. Phillips. We became poor. Now, before I move on, I want to read you a passage from one of Heidegger's students about his lectures, if I can find it here. Now, last week we had the good fortune of hearing Tatiana's lecture on anxiety. And Heidegger, among other things, as Connor knows, in Being and Time, brought the issue of anxiety to the foreground philosophically, particularly in talking about anxiety in the face of death. But the concept goes back to a German philosopher by the name of Schalow, whom Heidegger wrote on. And this is the interesting passage from one of Heidegger's students. We noticed this when Heidegger was writing Being and Time, and he said this in this lecture on Schalow. He came across this sentence, and it says, "The anxiety of life drives human beings out of the center." Then he said, and he took his fist and he pounded it on the table. He said, "Gentlemen, tell me a single sentence from Hegel that compares to this sentence in depth and profundity." So that was one of his famous little lines about the importance of angst, or anxiety. Okay. All right, any questions on that so far? And that's sort of a very, yes, Connor. Sorry. Yeah, Travis.
I was wondering if they were able to give him a sentence that was from Hegel.
I'll say that again.
When Heidegger asked if to give for his
take on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he was referring to a line in Schelling, and he was comparing Schelling and Hegel.
Okay.
And he was saying that Hegel's considered such a great thinker, but here's Schelling talking about anxiety, and where do we find in Hegel anything as brilliant as this? So he would make these kinds of statements, and he had a way, supposedly, a kind of flair and excitement in doing things. Tatiana.
Now, why was Heidegger so interested in anxiety to the fact that he even defined it as angst, and he gave us in psychology a new way to define, as in behavior, how to express this sort of emotion?
Right.
Why he touched in that particular feeling or expression of sensation, and what part in life was he in?
Well, you mean when he developed the idea of anxiety? Well, it was really early in his career, and he'd become influenced not only by Schelling, but by a student of Schelling, Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard had written a book called The Concept of Anxiety or Dread. Now, you raise a good question, because one of the things Heidegger tried to do, because most philosophers had completely discounted the emotional side of life. And Heidegger said, we're thinking beings, but thinking is also connected to emotion and to moods. And that these moods, like anxiety and fear, reveal something about the human condition. And we cannot understand ourselves as human beings if we don't also understand these moods. Another basic mood is fear. And Heidegger distinguishes fear and anxiety. Fear is of always something specific. Like I might be afraid of driving at night. And that's a specific thing. But anxiety is more indefinite. I may have anxiety and I may not even be able to pinpoint it. And Tatiana, you might say, or Frank, are you anxious? And I say, yes. Why are you anxious? I really don't know. But still, anxiety tells us something about our relationship to the world. Yes?
I want to add that, like, I know, like, a lot of people who have anxiety, like, they explain that as I can't stop thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I have anxiety, and
right.
It's just, like, I just can't stop thinking about things. Just constantly.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, like the thoughts don't go away, and then I connect more thoughts, and then it just leads to more anxiety.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that's the basic difference, because fear, you can kind of focus on it and identify it. But the indeterminateness of anxiety makes it more difficult to and to come to terms with. Now, Heidegger said anxiety, however, is positive philosophically, because it turns our attention away from the little things in the world and draws us back to ourselves. So it's a kind of like a catalyst that can allow us to bring ourselves into question. So Heidegger points out that a lot of the great creative minds suffered from anxiety. So Yes, I think in today's world, in the Dr. Drew world, my good buddy Dr. Drew, as I say, anxieties tended, and Tatiana would say that, there's tends to look at it as a kind of disorder. And in a certain sense it might be, but Heidegger says it also has a positive side to it, because it stimulates our ability to question. I sometimes think like when great athletes like Peyton Manning go on the field, they have a kind of anxiety when they just step onto the field. And they try to now sort of channel it in a positive way. So there's sort of that double side to anxiety. But that's also the nature of the phenomenon, the complexity of it. Tatiana, would you add something to that since you studied that?
The fact that, yes, like anxiety, like you said, it's linked to fear, because it not only brings you up to introspection, but also will make you more focused and alert to whatever it might be threatening to your existence.
Right.
So that has a component of it. And anxiety can serve as a moderator for optimal development.
Right, right.
So indeed, Heidegger had a very neat and good concept of what anxiety means. And how he explained it in one of his pieces, it was very clear.
Right.
So yeah, it has the positive and negative.
Right. And Heidegger says, in a way, all anxiety at bottom is connected to our relationship to death. Because death has that indeterminate way of potentially taking everything from us. And at the same time, death reveals all that we have and who we are.
What we couldn't accomplish.
Right. And so, as Tatiana and I were talking earlier, death has that double-edged sword to it. Because it also reveals to me the importance of maximizing my possibilities, of doing everything in the moment and getting the most out of it. And one of the things Heidegger points out in the discussion of death in Being and Time is that the everyday view is that we tend to think of death as something related to aging and something that happens to older people, which is true. But death can happen at any point, and we have to be aware of that and thereby maximize. And one of Heidegger's famous quotes, which he got from Martin Luther, he says that as soon as you were born, you're old enough to die. So that's another one of his kind of primary insights. Yes.
So I'm just going to assume Heidegger was eventually an atheist.
Well, that's a good question too. And he kind of swung back and forth. He was very religious and was influenced both by the Protestant and the Christian tradition. But as he developed his philosophy, he claimed that philosophy had to step back from religion. And he didn't want to call it atheist, but it had to have an autonomy to it that wasn't restricted by faith. So there's certainly that aspect. Now in his later years, he began to develop a, how do I want to put it, a kind of post-Christian view of what he called the holy, which he connected to poetry. And the holy or the sacred wasn't confined to any religious tradition. But it was something that he said still had a kind of power to it, even though it could not be confined to any belief in a deity. So in that sense, I think he was religious, but he was not religious in believing in a specific deity or religious tradition, for that matter. Does that... Yeah, and he actually quotes this line from Hölderlin, the poet, and Heidegger says, we live in this needy time, in this destitute time, when the old gods have fled and the new gods haven't come. And that's sort of the period of nihilism, or what Nietzsche called the death of God. But Heidegger was not committed to saying that there was no God. So I think that's the difference.
So maybe like more agnostic.
Yeah, right, Right. At least philosophically.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Now, when he was buried, no, I didn't put that right. As they say, I don't know if I have it in there, when he was put to rest, he had instructed that a Catholic priest say the sort of last words at his burial. And Heidegger had this favorite passage from the Bible, which he thought was philosophical, which you may have heard. It says, "Ask and you will receive, seek and you will find." So he had a religious dimension, but he wasn't a believer of a doctrine. Yeah. So I think in that sense he wasn't, he would be more agnostic. Yeah. Tatiana, do you have some more questions?
No, with regards, I think Heidegger's life and treatment, how was he, since he was very popular amongst his peers and his fellows, and he was so influential, did he ever achieve any political view or position?
Well,
You're going to get to that.
yeah, I don't know if I want to get to that.
Sorry.
And that's kind of still sort of
Ask
in the
and you
works.
shall receive, see?
But I will tell you this, and to give he did briefly take over as chancellor of the University of Freiburg. This was controversial around 1933 as the National Socialists came to power. And some of his colleagues believed that he was best suited to lead the university. And one of the interesting things when he gave his address, for better or for worse, he talked about the importance that philosophy had in leading the university forward. Now, it turned out to be a double-edged sword because he later had to resign the position. And it also clouded his reputation because he had that connection to the National Socialists. Now, politically, I think it's interesting because he does have some interesting discussions about politics beyond that. He was very interested in the formation of the Greek political state. And he has some very interesting writings on that as well. So I'd have to say in a sort of synopsis that he had political implications, some more positive than others, but I don't think he was someone that you can read without completely considering his political stance, even apart from his connection in 1933. I don't know, does that help answering that?
Oh, plenty.
Okay, thanks. All right, do you want me to talk a little bit briefly about how I got interested in Heidegger?
Yes.
Okay. Now, going back a long time ago when I started at the University of Denver, like some of you, I was a philosophy major when I started. And I came in and we had 2 young professors that were just hired. As I like to kid people, they were even younger than Chris Supernaut. One had just gotten his PhD from Penn State. He was around 25 or 26. And the other had just gotten his PhD. Oh, and he studied Kant, and his emphasis was on Kant. The other had just gotten his PhD and written a dissertation on Heidegger. He was around 27, 28. And he was from the University of Colorado. So those were my 2 mentors. And every Friday afternoon, these 2 guys and a couple others and the philosophy club would all meet at what was called the Stadium Inn, which was a, what would you call it, a bar? Near the university. Of course, I didn't drink, Tatiana.
No, you're good.
And so,
you better bring.
but we would all meet and discuss philosophy. So we were a very closely connected group, and also because we had a lot of young professors as well, younger than Supernaut, as I said before. Now, when I took my first course as an undergraduate, I took this course dealing with the history of philosophy, and one of the figures, I took it from the guy who was the Heidegger expert. And one of the first things I read on Heidegger was this discussion of death. We had an excerpt that the professor presented. from Being and Time about death and anxiety. And once I read that, it was like, I couldn't understand a lot of it, but it was like something I'd never read before, so I really got into it. Let me see if I can read you, let's see if I can read you a good passage here. And Heidegger has his own unique terminology.
Yeah, that's what that was what I was struggled with.
Yeah, and everyone
getting the
struggles.
terminology down.
Yeah. I remember when I first, and I'll talk a little about this, I said, gee, I don't know if I can understand any of this. I'll read you his conception of death. And, yeah, here it is. Here's our full existential and ontological conception of death can now be defined as follows. As the end of human existence, death is our own most possibility. Certain and as such indefinite, non-relational, and not to be outstripped. At the end of human existence, death is that towards which each of us is projected. Now that's a hard thing to kind of understand. But basically what Heidegger's trying to say is that, first of all, death, as we all know, today's April 15th, tax day. There are only two things that are certain, death and taxes. But, what was that? And also, though, but here's the interesting part. This is what provokes anxiety. It's the indefiniteness of death. And so, in other words, you never know when it's going to happen. I like to tell this story in my intro class. We haven't gotten to that yet. But,
Friday.
yeah, or probably Monday. Of my close encounter with death, and this always reminds me of Heidegger. And I was in a job interview in the upper Michigan. It was around Thanksgiving, and I had to fly back to New Orleans. And it was one of these little propeller planes, commuter planes, maybe about 7 or 8 people. And we got up in the air, and then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. And the weather just turned like violent. And this little plane was getting tossed around. And people were kind of screaming. Well, I looked out. And I was hanging on there to the armrest. And I looked out, and all of a sudden I saw the sparks forming along the engine, coming right at me. And I said, this does not look good. And I kind of closed my eyes, and then I opened them, and then there was this gigantic explosion. And this gulf of flames sort of came at me. And I said, this is probably it. But then I was okay, and then the pilot got on and said, folks, we've been hit by a lightning bolt, and it's knocked out one of our engines. But we're going to be okay, don't worry. There's nothing to worry. That's what they always say.
Right.
And we had one engine left, and we made it back in. Now, what Heidegger would say, that's like a near-death experience. That puts in perspective all my other possibilities. It helps me see what's really important and what really isn't important. And so Heidegger says we don't always have these near-death experiences, but we have to become aware that death can intervene, or the potential of death can intervene at any moment. And that's the anxiety of death, because it's there. And we even hear on the news, unfortunately, of tragedies where children pass. And so the idea of what Heidegger calls the authentic relationship to death is to recognize death, not be morbid about it, but to recognize it, become aware of it, and then maximize your possibilities at each moment. Now, let's get back and I'll sort of finish up how I got interested in Heidegger. Well, I had that one course, and then the next semester I took a course from the Kant guy from Penn State. Then the following, it would have been my sophomore year, there was a Heidegger seminar, and at that time, the University of Denver had a joint master's and undergraduate program. So the Heidegger seminar was co-listed. And we had some philosophy graduate students there who also used to come to the Stadium Inn to drink. And so we had to do a term paper. So I asked my professor, what do you think would be a good topic to write on? He says, well, Frank, you have some background in Kant, and Heidegger wrote about Kant. Why don't you write about Heidegger's interpretation of Kant? And this is Heidegger's famous book called Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics from 1929, right after being in time. So I wrote my term paper. It was pretty long on Heidegger's interpretation of Kant. I remember typing it. Of course, in those days, I don't want to say how long ago, we had no computers. So you would type it all out and retype it. And anyway, I then wrote my honors thesis on Kant and a little bit on Heidegger. And then when I was looking for a graduate program, I found out that Tulane had a Heidegger specialist, and actually another person. So that's why I ended up coming to Tulane. So I wrote my master's thesis, and that day you had to write a master. So I wrote it mainly on Kant, and then I wrote my dissertation on Heidegger and Kant. And so these are, I'm just going to show you some of my books. And this was my dissertation. This was my first book, Imagination and Existence, which is Heidegger's interpretation of Kant's ethics. And that was published in '86. And this is my longest book from '92. This is called The Renewal of the Heidegger-Kant Dialogue. And then, as Tatiana knows, because she helped me with my website, and this is my latest book, Departures. It doesn't sell very well. I'm just kidding. At the crossroads between Heidegger and Kant, but it has a nice cover. So
I think we need to advertise for those.
yeah, we need more advertising. So all that really came out of that one term paper. So that was how I became interested, and I think I was fortunate to have good professors, and it was at a good time in which there was a lot of interest in these topics. In those days, the opportunities for going into business weren't very good, so a lot of the students wanted to go into philosophy because they really didn't have many opportunities to make money. So it was a sort of a different culture at that time. Okay. All right. Any questions?
With regard to the works that you just showed us,
Right.
all the departures, would you mind giving us a synopsis of what the books are, and aside from the title and the subject? And if we do want to make a purchase, where would it?
Well, you can get them on Amazon.
On
Yeah,
Amazon
right.
for the most part?
Right.
Amazon Prime? Yes, 2
Right.
days shipping free.
Yeah.
And
But really, what I've tried to do is develop different aspects of Heidegger's interpretation of Kant. And in Departures, my emphasis is on an aspect that Heidegger left undeveloped. And as Karen knows from taking the Kant course now, one of the things Kant developed was aesthetics. And Heidegger, though he was very interested in art, didn't really address Kant's aesthetics very much. So in Departures, though I do take a tack that develops a lot of Heidegger's views on Kant, I then at the end try to show how there's a lot of area concerning Kant's aesthetic art and beauty that could be developed further. And so I try to provide an interpretation of that. And then I try to show that in this understanding of beauty, we get a new understanding of language as well. Because art is not just logical, art proceeds through metaphor and symbol, a kind of figurative discourse. And this sort of opens up a new area of language to explore. And that's pretty much what my thesis is in that book.
I like the fact that in one of the pieces that you mentioned from Heidegger, in which he was making assertions that through our personality or our behavior or the expression of our personality, we will understand more with regards to human. And it's something that nowadays with neuroscience and,
Right.
and even with philosophy of mind, we're approaching to prove he's on point.
Right.
So it's a good link between cognitive and emotion.
Right, right. Well, I think that's true. And sort of as a final note, one of the things I really like about Heidegger and got me interested is he wasn't just presenting philosophical views. He said philosophy is something you got to get engaged in, and you have to let it work through you and change you. Emotionally, spiritually, as well as intellectually. And I think that's different than a lot of thinkers. It's almost semi-religious in the way that you allow philosophy to take hold and animate you and give you this kind of deeper view of life. And the emotional element is indispensable in that. Right. Yes, come.
I'm just curious how the process of when you translated the poverty piece, how that went. How long did it take?
It took a long time.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
And also, there are a lot of German idioms, and I had a
That's what I was gonna
co-translator.
ask,
Yeah, so it's,
So
and
it's
I'm kind of
long.
amazed, like the people who translate being and time, even the first translation, this is the second translation. Man, that must have been a real undertaking when they did that. And people who translated being and time in Japanese. And as you know from taking the course, Heidegger's language is so difficult to begin with. So I have a lot of admiration for the translators.
One of the reasons why he liked or he expressed his pieces within his own language, do you think is because of the complexity of his thinking?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Now he knew language. He knew a lot of languages, so he was he knew Greek and he knew Latin. So he could move back and forth between German, Greek, and Latin. This friend of mine who came over from Italy and studied with Heidegger's assistant in Freiburg, he developed in the old European school where you learn a lot of language. Like Tatiana, you know a lot of languages. So this friend of mine, he was fluent in English, German, Latin, Greek, and Italian and French. And not only could read them, could write them. And I'm in awe of that. That's someone that I hold up in high esteem.
Yeah, there's a name for that. It's a polyglot.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow,
More
interesting.
than, more than
How long
human.
did it take him? Did he learn that as a like a child or? As a
Well,
student?
that I don't know, Mr. Lee, but
I'm always wondering if it's like too late for me.
well, I do think that the Europeans are much better
Yeah.
at learning different languages. And one thing about being an American, we tend to think English is dominant. So I do think other cultures are better at that. Yeah.
We talk really monotonously, whereas in Europe they use a lot of emotion in their
Right.
language, and so like I find like when I'm trying to speak French, I just like it feels really weird.
Yeah.
I'm just like, why do I feel so emotional right now?
Yeah.
It might be a problem.
Tatiana, don't you know 3 languages?
I do. I speak Spanish, English, Portuguese, a little bit of Latin because I had it in high school, and a little bit of Italian because I like it.
Yeah.
But also there is a connection between language and the ability to relate to the emotion of the language. So by feeling sensations or eliciting something, you might be able to recall better because you're pairing that emotion to a word or a meaning, and then you can recall easier. And my languages, or the ones that I know that they are not Latin based per se, is only English. All the other ones, they have something in common.
Mhm.
So that's why it's an easy transition for me. And the little bit of that I know from Arabic is probably just because of my past generations, and there is a link, a genetic link, and a genetic predisposition to the language learning habit.
Mhm.
So that's the main reason why
Right.
I think.
High schools, I think, have lost a lot of it because there used to be, in the religious high schools, you might have Latin and Greek, and a lot of that's been phased out.
when I went to, because I went to Catholic high school, I didn't graduate from one, but yeah, I had to take Latin 8th and 9th grade years.
Right.
And then you could choose if you wanted to stick with it or whatever you wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I went to a Catholic high school and we had Latin.
Usually the mass would be performed in Latin too, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So people did have some familiarity with that.
I was curious,
Yeah, go ahead.
this might be a whole nother field, but I was curious about him being a Nazi.
I'll probably take that up later. There's a lot of debate about that. And the one thing he had going for him, but maybe in retrospect, is that he did resign from his position. But he was still teaching up through the war and past the war.
Do you think that maybe one of the reasons why he was teaching through the war and past the war is because he strongly believed in education, and his lectures were so sought after that that was also like a refugee for whoever was trying to escape from those scenarios?
Well, that's an interesting idea. And I think it goes both ways. I think there are elements of it that you can interpret very negatively. And I think the challenge is how much that affects your understanding of his thinking as well going forward. Now, when I started studying Heidegger, a lot of the details really weren't very well known. So there was a recognition that he had been in Germany, that he was connected with National Socialism. But those were the days when we didn't have the internet, or there wasn't a lot of dissemination of that kind of information. So I think now it's a little bit different. But the other side of the coin is there's so much influence. And thanks to Tatiana helping me with my website, I get emails from people around the world, from Brazil, I got one from Turkey, and people asking about writing dissertations on Heidegger. So he's still very influential, and I think there'll be a lot of dissertations written about what his connection to National Socialism is.
Do you think there's like a little bit too much of a stigma? Because, I mean, he wasn't an SS officer.
No, right, right.
Just being in Germany at that time shouldn't automatically vilify you.
Right.
You know?
And there were a lot of intellectuals who were also caught up
Yeah.
in that time. And he had his family there, and there were a lot of other issues. Now, some of his students did leave and went to the United States. One of his most famous students, Hannah Arendt, was, of course, Jewish. And that Heidegger was a very, how do I want to put it without being too graphic, was a very close friend of hers. And there's been a lot written on that. And that's why it's such a complex issue, because there's so many different facets of it. So if you want to write a dissertation, there's one waiting to be written.
Do you think that maybe perhaps his public persona was not was more important, or it was relevant to his influence in the youth instead of his political views? It was perhaps even more. I mean, his public persona with regards to education and teaching and his lectures was by default a lot more important than what he thought or how he thought on the political.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. I understand what you're saying, and I think that's true. He thought that his philosophy would speak for itself, and that his personal views were always far down the list. And I think that was really his position. But his critics are going to say, well, that's not going far enough. But I think that's in the ballpark of where he was probably coming from. Yeah. So I think that's a good insight. All right, well, I hope that's helpful, and I hope that people will take the idea.